Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Metzia daf Yud Chet. Today's daf is sponsored in honor of Audrey Mondro from her children and grandchildren. You're an example of a lifetime learner. Today's daf is sponsored by Gabrielle and Daniel Altman in honor of the marriage of their daughter Sophia Altman today, and also the recent marriage of their son Isaac Altman and the yahrzeit of Moshe Rabbeinu. Sending brachot that the ultimate shadchan find matches for all those who are looking. Today's daf is sponsored by Sylvia Sarah Devorah Simmons in loving memory of her father, Avram Nachum ben Yisrael Similis, Zichrono Levrachan, is yahrzeit today. Survivor of the Kovno ghetto, a brand plucked from burning fire, he planted the seeds of Torah learning with his enduring faith and still inspiring today and in the future. Okay, now we are going to get started with a quick review of what we were up to because we kind of had to stop in the middle, and it's important to understand the basics before we get into today's daf. So we had this statement starting really at the very bottom of Yud Zayin Amud Aleph of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, "Hato'en achal ma'aseh bitin," which means somebody claims that something was paid. What kind of thing was paid? A ma'aseh bitin, which is basically something that is a given, even if you don't have a document. It's as if you have it. So, for example, the most basic example is a ketuba. If a woman doesn't have a ketuba, she still can collect her ketuba money because even if the husband didn't write her ketuba, she has rights to go to the court when the husband divorces her or dies and says, okay, I get the money that the ketuba said, even though the ketuba didn't say it, because the the court instituted that every woman gets a ketuba. So because of that, comes Rabbi Yochanan, he says, I'll take this one step farther. If someone has a maaseh beiti, meaning if there's an issue about a ketuba, and the woman doesn't have a ketuba to say, I can collect my ketuba, and the husband claims, well, you don't have it because I already paid you back and we ripped it up, he's not believed, okay? Because it's such a strong view that is, given to her. How would he prove it then? He would have to have witnesses that saw him give it to her, okay? In the absence of witnesses or some sort of a receipt, we'll use that word later, a shovar is a receipt, or some sort of receipt, if he doesn't produce witnesses or a receipt, he is not trusted to say, right? Normally, if let's say in a loan, the creditor doesn't have a document, well then the borrower is believed to say, I paid it back. That's why he doesn't have a document. So now Rabbi Chia said to Rabbi Chia bar Abba said to Rabbi Yochanan, isn't that a Mishnah? Okay, a Mishnah in Ketubot that says if a woman pulls out her get and doesn't have a ketuba, she can collect her ketuba. So isn't that the same thing? To which Rabbi Yochanan said, look, you can learn that from the Mishnah. And in fact, I do learn it from the Mishnah, but it's not so clear. And that's why I had to clarify. Not saying why it wasn't so clear. And then Abaye suggests that Rabbi Yochanan's wrong and the Mishnah is really talking only in a place where they don't write ketubas. But that means that if I live in a city where they write ketubas and I just happen not to have a ketuba, I can't claim it, okay, because I don't have a ketuba. And then Rabbi Yochanan won't be able to prove anything. But then Abaye changes his mind. And this is what we're in the middle of. Abaye changes his mind. It says there's no way this Mishnah is talking about what I said, only in a place where they don't write ketubas, because we'll have a problem, which is what? And then we're almost going to get started with our daf today, which is you can never have a case where a woman who's widowed from a betrothal will be able to get her ketuba. Because in places where they write ketubas, they don't write. In other words, again, if you say our Mishnah is not talking about a place where they write ketubas, place where they write ketubas, if you don't bring a ketuba, well, the husband could just say, I paid you back. So a woman who gets widowed from a betrothal, now normally they didn't write ketubas for betrothals, but let's say I live in New York, and in New York, everybody writes ketubas to women. But I was widowed from a betrothal, and I don't have a ketuba because they never write ketubas. But in this city, they won't accept my statement. My husband will be believed. So I'll never get a ketuba. Well, in this case, it won't be my husband. It'll be his heirs. But his heirs can always claim, the husband paid her. So if that's the case, then basically you'd never have a case where an almana can get from the heirs, to which we try to prove now. How do we know an almana gets her ketuba from Erusin if she didn't have a ketuba written? And that was Abaye's whole proof. And basically, we're going to have two attempts. One we finished, and that we rejected. And the second one, we're going to suggest a reject. And then we're going to have to re-edit Abaye's words and say, it can't be he proved it from there. Okay? So that's what we're going to start with today. Starting from the second line in Daf Yud Chet. So second attempt, Marka Shisha brought an attempt to prove this statement that the whole thing that was at the premise of Abaye's proof about an almana min ha'erusin, that she gets her ketuba. And the assumption is, right, you'd have to say, even if she doesn't have a ketuba written. To which Miditani Rabbi Zeira, but here's the second attempt. Ishto arusa. We have a man married, betrothed to a woman, but never married, and then he dies. So, she dies. Lo onaim. He's not an onaim for her, right? You're an onaim. That's the status in between the death and the burial for your close relatives, but they weren't married yet. Okay, so even though you need a divorce from erusin, which we learned, but and we've actually seen the source a number of times, but he doesn't become an onaim for her. V'lo metamelaf. He's a kohen. He's not allowed to be impure to anyone other than his 7 close relatives, and one of them being his wife. But it says on the pasuk there, to his wife who he has a close connection to. Now, if they're only betrothed, they don't have a close connection because they're not living together yet. So he can't become impure to her. The this bright is gonna kind of be a parallel. It's gonna start with what he can't do and what she can't do. So the parallel is she's also not in a status of onen for him. And she can't become impure to him. Okay, what on earth does that mean? There's no forbidden for a bat kohen or the wife of a kohen to become impure to her husband. So what are we talking about? Lo metamalo must mean she doesn't, the way she sit sheva for him. She doesn't deal with the burial. She's not related to him yet fully. So she's not considered a wife for those purposes. Okay, second issue, or third issue really, we had onen tame meta. If she dies, eno yorsha. Usually the husband inherits her stuff. He doesn't inherit her because they weren't married yet. So it goes back to her family. Mate who, and here's the key line, govak to bata. He dies, and what's this? Right? This is from erusim, from betrothal. She gets her ketuba. There's his proof. That's what we were trying to prove. So Rabbi Yochanan bar Abba proves this for Rabbi Yochanan bar Ami, proves this for Abaye, to which the Gemara rejects it and says, "What are you talking about? Doma de katavla. Maybe it's only in a case where he actually wrote a ketuba, but without a ketuba, how could she possibly collect it? Again, assuming she lives in a place like New York where they write ketubas to their wives, and she doesn't have one because she's betrothed, but either which way, she doesn't have one. And in New York, you can't collect a ketuba without a ketuba document. So when it says, if he dies, she gets her ketuba, maybe it's only if she actually has a ketuba, because there were unique cases where the husband decided to write the ketuba early, right? Even though he didn't need to write it during the betrothal period, but maybe he did. And only then could she collect it. And then that doesn't prove anything. But to which the Gemara says, now you might say, okay, I don't need this source to tell me if, what does it mean to katavla? He wrote her a document promising in the event of death, I will give you this amount of money. So of course she gets it. She has a document saying, right, the heirs have to pay her this amount of money if the man dies. So you don't need a brighta to tell me, right? That's just, it's like any IOU that you would get paid. I don't have we don't need a Mishna to tell you if you have an IOU, you could get paid. That would be weird. Well, the truth is, and this is why I mentioned before, that this is set up in parallel, right? The Mishna talks about, the brighta talks about what happens with her, what happens with him. What happens if she dies, what happens if he dies. So why did they mention this line, which is really totally unnecessary, that if he dies, she gets her ketuba? Well, it's to parallel it to, right, Eino Yorsha Itzrichale. I'm sorry, Meta Eino Yorsha Itzrichale, because they needed to tell you if she dies, he doesn't inherit her property. So then they had to say something. What happens if he dies? Well, instead of inheriting, she's supposed to get the ketuba. Well, she gets her ketuba. Now, it's obvious she gets her ketuba if he wrote her ketuba document. But they're mentioning it because they're just paralleling. We just need a parallel case. So it's not really a chiddush. The chiddush is if she dies, he doesn't inherit her stuff. She would if she were married. So you can't prove it from here. This doesn't prove to you that a woman who's widowed from a betrothal, gets her ketuba even if she doesn't have a written ketuba. So therefore, we're back to square one. So now we have to reread Abaye. So again, what was Abaye trying to say? Abaye was trying to prove from this Mishnah. Okay, let's just go back again. It's on like the 4th line of Yud Zayin Amabet. Hotzia get ve'eni mo ketuba govak tubata. If she pulls out a get, she doesn't, right, proving she's divorced. she doesn't have a ketuba, she can get her ketuba money. Meaning, okay, again, you have to make this jump, but it means that he can't claim, I already paid you the money. Okay, because look, you don't have an IOU, you don't have a ketuba, right? You have a get, but you don't have a ketuba. So that proves that a woman, what Rabbi Yochanan said, a woman who has a maaseh beit din, who has a commitment that the court will impose if he doesn't have one, can always claim her ketuba money back, even if she doesn't have the ketuba in hand, even if she had a written ketuba, but right now doesn't have it, say it got lost, she can always go to court, claim to get her money, and he is never believed to say, I paid you back, unless, of course, he produces witnesses or has a shovar, a receipt. But in the absence of that, his claim is not believed in court. So comes Abaye and says, how can I prove it from that Mishnah? And he's going to, again, he has to prove that this is even in a case like New York where they write ketubas, okay? And not in a place where maybe they just never write ketubas because, again, why would you not write ketubas? I just want to be clear. We don't write ketubas because it's just, again, we do write ketubas, but why would you have a place that didn't? Because it's a court-imposed obligation. So you wouldn't need a ketuba, really. We do it anyway, but theoretically, one could claim you don't need it because when the husband dies, the court says, okay, you have to pay her. This is just something every single Jew has to do. So why do you need a document for it? So now what we have to prove is that this Mishnah that says she takes out a get and doesn't have a ketuba, she can get her ketuba, is even in a place where they write ketubas and she doesn't have one, she could still get it, right? We have to prove that. So now, it wasn't because he brought up this thing about the almanim and eris and how would she ever get a ketuba. Forget that. We couldn't prove that she actually does. Okay, maybe she only gets it when he writes her one, but if he didn't write her one, maybe she needs a document, and that wouldn't prove anything. So, so now we have to process of elimination. It can't be, now it's going to be, it can't be two things. It can't be, it's one that's predicated on the other. It can't be that it's talking about in a place where they don't write ketubas, okay? And to get hainu ketubata. Maybe, now, in a place where you don't have a ketuba, so what do you have to do to get your ketuba money? You have to prove you're divorced. So perhaps when it's said here, and now let's look at the wording, Hotzia get ve'ein imo tuba gova ketubata. If she pulls out a get and says, oh, look, here's my get. This proves I'm divorced, which means basically maybe you would say, and we have to reject this possibility, otherwise we won't be able to prove Rabbi Yochanan from here. But if you say, this is only in a place where there's no ketubas. Now, if I live in, I don't know, Timbuktu, and there they don't write ketubas. So if I live in that place and they don't write ketubas, maybe my get functions like a ketuba. Okay, my get basically proves I'm divorced, which proves that I get my rights to my ketuba. In which case, let's say I don't have a get in hand, or right, somehow prove I'm divorced, but I don't have a get. Let's say I bring witnesses that say I'm divorced and I don't have a get. Well, it's my get that actually is the document that allows me to collect my ketuba, which means if I don't have it, well, then my husband can claim I paid it back. And then that goes against Rabbi Yochanan. So we have to basically say this isn't the case. The reason it works in this mission is not because in a place like Timbuktu, it's only in a place like Timbuktu, and it's only in a place where she produced it, like it's only because, let's say it this way, it's because her get functions like a ketuba. And we want to say that is not true, okay? Once we prove it's not true, we then assume it's even in a place where you have a ketuba, and it's not because she produces the get and the get replaces the ketuba. It's because it's a maaseh beit din, and any maaseh beit din, it's a done deal. We never believe the husband to say, I paid it back. So now we're going to get into, I see some things in the chat, and all the things you're saying in the chat are going to come up right now. So patience. So now the Gemara is going to say, if you're going to say it was and her get is her ketuba, atu get mana matayim ktive. So we're going to have a series of questions and issues why this can't be. And then we're going to say, well, maybe you'll say it could be, but we're going to come up with another. Okay, so it's going to be a bit of a back and forth to try to basically reject this possibility, which then would prove Rabbi Yochanan. So, atu get mana matayim ktive. How could you possibly say that the get is like her ketuba? A get never says anything about 100 zuz, 200 zuz. It doesn't give the amounts that the woman's supposed to get. How can you possibly say the get can function like a ketuba? The get is not an IOU. There's no money amounts. There's no commitment of money, anything like that. Well, you could say, no, maybe the get does work as a ketuba. And the fact it doesn't have a money amount doesn't really matter because, again, what does the get prove? She's divorced. And what does the Beit Din say? If she's divorced, she gets 200 zuz or 100 zuz based on whether she was a virgin at the time or wasn't a virgin at the time. But basically, you don't need it to say it in the document because it's a kina Rabbanan lemigbe command dame. And therefore, liton velema parati. So again, you could say maybe the rabbis instituted that she could get her ketuba with her get, right? It's as if the Manamatayim was written in because it's obvious that that's what she gets. And then liton velema parati. But then he could claim, sorry, that's it. Period. So then they say, well, then if the get functions as her ketuba document, so liton velema parati. So then why couldn't he just claim she pulls out the get and he says, well, I paid it back. So they say, well, in other words, because why did they say liton velema parati? If it's a ketuba, right, we're going to say, if we really say it's a ketuba, what's the whole point? The point is there's a chiddush here. Then normally, if you're the malveh, let's say, you lend money, and you don't have the shar in hand, so your argument is weakened. And we believe the loveh, the borrower, when he says, I paid it back. But in a ketuba, the whole chiddush here is we don't, because her what's coming to her way, her ability to collect this money is so strong that he's not believed to say, I paid it back, even if she doesn't have the document. Now, in this case, why don't we say, but if maybe she really does need her ketuba to prove it. But a get would be different because a get is a document proving divorce. Now, he could claim, yeah, she has a get, but I already paid her back. Okay. And therefore, we're going to say this can't be that her get functions as her ketuba because that wouldn't allow her to collect money based on it. In other words, imagine they get divorced in September and he pays her the ketuba money, but we don't rip up the get. She keeps the get. So the get isn't really a proof that he didn't pay it. The fact that she's holding the get in hand. It's not like an IOU document. So that would be weird. So maybe that's why we can reject this and say it can't be talking about that the get functions like a ketuba because then she should have ripped it up. If we're talking about a place where they don't write ketubas and the get functions like the ketuba, then he should have ripped it up. So now they're going to say, now maybe he can say, no, you should have ripped it. In other words, yeah, the get functions like a ketuba and you should have ripped it up. And therefore, I'm believed. And again, it says you're not, right? So now maybe he could be believed to say that. So Amralan, lo shiva. So now, I'm sorry, this is our claim. Sorry, I just made a mistake. I said it wrong. If you want to say that the court can basically undermine, in other words, this is, again, we're back to saying maybe this really is only in a case where they don't write ketubas. The get is the ketuba, and the court should have said to the husband, why don't we believe you? Because here is the case. The women don't write ketubas in Timbuktu, and therefore their gets are their ketubas, and therefore you should have ripped the get. Now, if the get is an IOU in this place, then you should rip up the get when you're done, because otherwise she's going to claim it. And the fact that it's still intact proves that you didn't pay it. And maybe that's why he's not believed. And then again, it becomes this very unique case and doesn't teach us anything about Rabbi Yochanan. So now they're going to say, I'm sorry, Amarlan, lo shabatan. What do you mean? I wanted to rip it up, but my wife wouldn't let me, my ex-wife. Why? I'm Rabbi Yochanan. She said I need my get to prove that I'm divorced. Now, nowadays, we rip up the get for other reasons, okay? But now, in those days, she kept her get as proof that she was divorced. So that's why he didn't rip it up. So basically, we're back to, perhaps that's not what we're talking about here. V'chi tema amrina. Sorry, maybe, right. So now, v'chi tema amrina le, ibai lach lemikre u'michtav agabe, gita denan de karinu, lo mishum de gita psulahu, ela ki'echa de lo tigbe bezimna acharita. Now, maybe he could claim, listen, the court can claim the following. We say to him, you should have ripped it. Abaye. I'm going back to the beginning now. I read a lot of words and I want to explain them. The court could say to him, you should have ripped it. Again, if we can prove that this is right, then we're going to basically say that this Mishnah, the reason she could collect her ketuba is because we don't believe the husband. Okay? But only in this unique case. And then Rabbi Yochanan can't prove anything. So now we're going to say, why would he be believed in this? Why basically say it's only in this case? Because it's clear that he didn't pay it back. Because if he had paid it back, what should he do? Now, she wants to get to prove she's divorced so she can get married to somebody else. But you could say to the husband, you should have ripped it. And right on the back of it. Gita dinan de karinu. This get that we ripped, lo mishum de gita psulu, is not because it's a disqualified get, okay, which would be a reason you rip a get to say, oh, the get's no good. Ela kihecha de lo tigbe bezim na achrite. But we ripped it up so that she can't use it to collect because we're living in Timbuktu and there the get functions like a ketuba. And the fact that it's not ripped and written on the back is proof that he obviously didn't pay. And that's why we don't let him collect it. That's why we don't believe him to say, I already paid it back. To which the Gemara says, you can't assume that that was an option. Why can't you assume that that was an option? Interesting, because nowadays, again, this is also different. Atu called to migbe. What, does every woman get her ketuba money in the court? What do you mean? It's an agreement between the husband and wife. The husband divorces her and gives her the money and done with it. They don't always go to court for this. So therefore, since they don't always go to court, there was no option to rip it up and sign on the back because you can't. It's not going to be meaningful if you sign it on the back without a court or anything like that. You would need it to be officially stamped or signed in the court. And since not everybody returns it in court, therefore you can't say that that's the case. Therefore, you can't say that this Mishnah was specifically referring to a case where we're living in Timbuktu and they don't write gets and they don't write ketubas. And the get here functions like the ketuba. And that's why he's not believed, because she produced a full get. Because her production of a full get doesn't mean anything about the collection, right? He could have paid her back and there was just no way to rip it up. In which case, that's not what's going on here. In which case, it must be back to square one, which is, this is anywhere, even in a place where the get is written, ketuba is written. Sorry, I keep confusing. Even in a case where ketuba is written. And in a case where ketuba is written, and yet she doesn't produce the ketuba, she is still believed, meaning he can't claim, I paid it back. We don't trust him unless he provides a solid proof that he paid. Okay, and that proves Rabbi Yochanan from this Mishnah, because what Abaye basically proved here, or again, the Gemara switched Abaye a little bit from what Abaye originally said and explained Abaye to be basically proving it from the Mishnah itself, because it can't be, the only alternative would be the get functions like a ketuba. And she does have a document because she has the get in her hand. But we basically prove the get in her hand doesn't prove anything. The get in her hand just proves she's divorced. Okay. And then, by the way, it's clear that when this Mishnah says she produces a get and doesn't have a ketuba, she can get her ketuba not because of the get itself. The get is not like an IOU document. It also could be, even if she doesn't produce an actual physical document of a get, she could produce two witnesses, Abaye Metzia, if you remember from our Masechet, from Gittin. Abaye Metzia basically are witnesses that say, we saw this guy give a get to his wife. And then she could come to court and say, here, I have witnesses to prove I got divorced, and I never got my ketuba money. And according to Rabbi Yochanan, if he doesn't bring proof that he paid her, like witnesses or a receipt, then basically he has to pay her, even though she's got no document in hand, and even if she's living in New York. Okay, that's what we've basically proven. And again, we tried to prove it. Again, Rabbi Yochanan says, let's just go through we'll do the quick review of the whole sugya. Rav Chia bar Abba said, isn't that an explicit Mishnah? And then why are you saying this? Rabbi Yochanan said, well, it would have been 100% clear from the Mishnah. And then Abaye said, yeah, in fact, not only would it not be 100% clear, I don't even think the Mishnah is saying that. But then Abaye changes his mind and says, no. I do think the Mishnah, you could learn it from the Mishnah. And here's how. trying to prove it from Amanim and Erusin, right? Because again, he has to prove that the Mishnah is even in a case where they write ketubas, like New York. You could still prove it without a ketuba. And then he says, otherwise, how would an almana ever get her ketuba? But then we actually proved it's not clear. We couldn't prove that the almana gets her ketuba. We had 2 attempts to try to prove it. We couldn't prove it. So then we switched Abaye to say he actually learns it from the language of the Mishnah itself, because the alternative that the get functions like a ketuba is not a valid argument. And in a place like Timbuktu. And that was what the Mishnah was talking about, not a valid argument, which means it's talking about in any case, even a place where they write ketubas, and even in a place where she had a ketuba but can't produce it, we're still going to believe her. And that's what we did. Now we're going to move on to a new Mishnah. So again, we're back to cases where you find a document on the ground and you don't know who it belongs to. So we have either a get of a woman, and you don't know, you have a woman who claims, oh, that's my divorce document. Can we give it to her? Or an emancipation document for a slave. Can we say, oh, you're a freed slave, Canaanite slave? Daitike, which is wills. So basically, I produce a document that said my father bequeathed me this land, and here, I'm living in this land is mine, okay? Or this object, or whatever it might be. I want to prove it's mine with this document that says, oh, it came to me in my will, in my father's will. Matana, okay, a gift. It's a deed saying, this house was given to you as a gift. This, whatever it is, these candlesticks were given to you as a gift, and here's a document that says it. Vishovarin, or receipts, like we talked about before, like a receipt. This get was paid, okay, or any kind of IOU is paid. We don't give this back. And the Mishnah is going to give you a reason, which doesn't always do that, but it gives you a reason here, which is going to lead us to our whole sugya, or half of the sugya we're going to see today. She'ani omel, because I can say, meaning one side can say, the owner, the husband, the one who originally had the property, yeah, it's true, I wrote this, but I decided not to give the get to my wife. I decided not to free my slave. Yeah, it's a valid document, but it's not going to prove anything because I never gave the gift. I never, the father changed the will. You could claim anything, that it was never actually used. And again, we've talked about this many times. That would explain why it's on the ground, right? Because I threw it in the garbage. Someone took it out of the garbage, forgot to shred it. And, now you're trying to use it. So now the Gemara says, we're going to do what's called an inference from the Mishnah, and from that raise a contradiction between the inference from our Mishnah to another Mishnah. Tama dinim lach shelo litnan. So it sounds like the reason is because the person, the owner, the husband, the whatever it is on that side of things can say, oh yeah, I never really ended up giving it. I changed my mind. But from here, what can you infer? Ha-amal tnu, but if the person says, oh yeah, I gave this as a gift, or I'm willing now to give it as a gift, okay, let's say it was the gift one, or give the get to my wife because either I already gave it to her, or if he says give it to my wife, he could be sending him as a messenger to give it to the wife. So as soon as the wife gets it, either it just proves she was already divorced, or at least she's divorced now. So, no tznim, afilu lizman meruba. Now, here we're adding an extra thing, which is the Mishnah never said within what time frame can this happen from when it got lost. Seems like, right? You find this on the street. We have no idea from when it was. You can give it, okay? That sounds reasonable. Except what? You might remember in Masechet Gittin, and we're going to specifically focus on the get issue today, on the get case, which is a get has to be written for this person, for this man with this wife. If it was written for somebody else, you can't use it. Now, if he finds, right, somebody, random person finds a get on the street, starts announcing anyone with the name. Okay, we're going to go with Yosef and Shimon because that's the one in the Mishnah. The Gemara they're going to talk about, anyone by the name of Yosef and Shimon. Did anyone by that name mean to divorce this wife, Miriam bat Rachel? And I'm taking very common names. You'll see why in a minute. And comes Yosef and Shimon and says, oh yeah, that's my get, and give it to my wife because I already divorced her, or I'm happy to divorce her now, and use it. He can't use that because if that's the case, we're worried that maybe there's another Yosef and Shimon in the city who wrote a divorce document for Miriam bat Rachel, and this guy's just using someone else's get, and that's an invalid get. And in fact, here comes the Mishnah, Uriminu. It contradicts a Mishnah in Gittin, which says, Hamevi get va'avad himenu. If somebody brings a get and it gets lost, So we have a messenger on his way to deliver a get, and he loses it, right? Classic. You're on the way to do something, drops on the road. Mitza'ola alter, so he looks around through his stuff. He looks on the street. He finds it. The wind blew it over to there. Okay, finds it right away. No problem. We're not worried about that. But imlav, if he doesn't find it right away, pasul, you can't use that get because maybe it's someone else's get, and who happens to have the same name as him and her, and that would be a problem. Okay, you say, what are the chances? But maybe Yosef and Shimon the second was planning on divorcing Miriam bat Rachel the second, and decided not to. The sofer left the get laying around. The get blew away, and this is what you found. Maybe it's someone else's get. And our Mishnah seems to imply you don't have to worry about that. So that's the big contradiction. To which Amar Raba lo kashya. That's not a difficulty, because it really depends on the situation, and each source was talking about a different situation, which is if there's a lot of caravans going back and forth, there's a lot of traffic of people moving in and out, there's a higher chance that there's someone else with the same name who lost this document and it got here. But and that's the Mishnah in Gittin. But our Mishnah is but here we're talking about in the boondocks. There's not a lot of people. You don't have to worry that the document came from somebody else because there's not a lot of passersby. There's not a lot of passersby, then it's unlikely that the get got here from somewhere else. Comes the Gemara and even limits Raba more and says, Raba even said you need two criteria to be worried. The Mishnah in Gittin, which says you can't reuse this get or use this get, they have to have two conditions in order to make it a problem. Number one, you have to have caravans going by, and even in that place, you need you need to know that there's two Yosef and Shimons in the city who are married to, by the way, they don't say this, but two Yosef and Shimons who are married to Miriam bat Rachel. Okay? So you'd have to have two of the same named people married to each other for this to be an issue. And then you have to worry that maybe it's theirs. Now, how do we know? Now, Raba didn't say that, but we assume Raba said that. And why do we assume Raba said that? From the following story. Because if you don't say that, kasha de Raba, the Raba is going to contradict himself in what happened in this situation. There was a get that was found in the Beit Din of Rav Huna. It was written on the get that the get was given in the city of Shviri. Mata is a city that is on the Rachis Nara, that's by the river Rachis. This doesn't sound like a very common city name, right? Now, by the way, in addition to the name of the husband, the name of the wife, you might remember all this, you need the name of the place in the get, okay? So you would have to have, by the way, right, if it wasn't clear, same name of the man, the same name as the woman, and the same city they were divorced in. So now this get was given in this city, and they found it, right? So they found it. It says that they found it in the Beit Din. Probably means they found it and brought it to the Beit Din, or near the Beit Din, let's say. And Amar Rav Huna, turning out I'm a bet, Hashinan l'shnei shviri. Now this is a bit radical. Rav Huna says we're worried there might be another city called Shviri, which happens to be on the Nahar Rachis, somewhere else. Okay, now it's unlikely there's such a thing. And in fact, some of the commentaries say that he meant this as a question. Do we have to worry that there's a Shviri Mata? Okay, there's two ways to read this sugya. Could be he's saying this radical position. Oh, maybe there's another name, Shviri, a little, right? But he basically didn't want to, according to that reading, that was a statement and not a question, he didn't want to give the get back. Now, he was the rabbi here in the Beit Din. And his two students, Rav Chisda and Raba. So Amar Rav Chisda le Raba. So one student says to the other, Puk ayemba, go look into this. Because in the evening, Rav Huna is going to question you about this. Now, either Rav Huna is going to check to make sure that you support his position, and that you can come up with supports for his position, or maybe Rav Huna is going to ask you what to do. Maybe he wants some advice, which is a little weird why we go to student. That's why it seems more likely that Rav Huna ruled this way, and then Rav Chisda said to Rabbi, you better brush up on your stuff and have a response for him. So Nafik Dak Vashkaf. So he went in and researched and said, I actually don't agree with Rav Huna. It's none, because it says in a Mishnah, this is a Mishnah we're going to get to in 2 days, Daf Kaf, Kol ma'aseh beitin harei ze yachzir. Any ma'aseh beitin, okay, something that's like a given kind of thing, or sorry, here it means anything that the court, this is Maaseh Beit Din, not like Rabbi Yochanan, this is something the court stamped, signed, all that, you can return. In other words, if the get was signed by the court, ratified by the court, then you can give it back to the woman. Now, basically what's he saying? Give this get to the woman. It's obvious the get was given. You don't have to worry. Maybe it was from this other city. Now, Beit Din de Rav Huna dechi makom shashayirot metziot. Now, the Beit Din of Rav Huna was a public place. That means there were caravans going by. That means that if you're worried, right, he should have been worried that maybe there was another person with the same name that, it came from. But Raba said you could give it back anyway. Now, didn't Raba say, if there's shayarot metziot, you can't return the get? But remember, the Gemara assumed he says you need two criteria to not return the get. Shayarot metziot and hilchsaku shnei Yosef ben Shimon. So, Alma, hilchsaku shnei Yosef ben Shimon in ilo lo. What was the reason he gave this get back? Because he didn't think that there were two cities by the name of Shvire that's al rachis nara. So that's not, we don't know of anything. And Rav Huna said, who knows? Maybe there is. And he said, as long as I don't know there is, I don't have to worry about it. And that's basically like saying, unless you know there's two Yosef ben Shimons in the city, you don't have to worry that maybe, there happens to be. You don't have to worry about that possibility. So from here, if we didn't say that Rabbi used both criteria, this has one criteria, not the other, so then Rabbi would contradict himself. So therefore, it must be Rabbi held. You need both criteria in order to say we don't give this get back to the woman because maybe it's someone else's get. So you need, again, caravans, and you need to know that there's two people with the same name married to the same woman with this, right? There's two men with the same name married to two women with the same name in the city. And in fact, Avid Rabba Uvada Be Kitana de Pumbedita Kishmati. He had a case where there was something with flax. We don't know yet what. There was a house of flax, the way we could literally translate this. In Pumbedita, there was a case where they found a get by this area of flax something. We'll see what it was in a minute, or we'll see two opinions, where he ruled like his opinion, which again means there was one criteria, but not the other. Now, there's going to be a debate about which criteria was there and which wasn't. But either which way, he gave the get back to the woman because he assumed, look, it doesn't have both caravans that go there, and we know that there's two people with the same name. So the question is, what kind of flax something was it, and what did that mean about the kind of place, and which was the criteria that was there and which one wasn't? So some people say, it was where they sold flax. Now, if they're selling flax, that's a shuk. If it's a shuk, that's a place, a market, that's a place where people are going all the time, which means that issue was an issue. But it must be he gave the get back to the woman because it wasn't known that there were two people married by that same name in the city, even though there were shayarot. Some people say it was where they were soaking the flax. Now, soaking the flax is probably in someone's private field. It's not a place where a lot of people go, and therefore you didn't have the concern of the shayarot. But there were known to be two people by that same name in the city, but because there weren't a lot of shayarot going there, we weren't worried that somehow the get from the other couple got to here. Okay, so you see here, in either which way you look at the case, it had one criteria, it didn't have the other, and that's why he allowed the get to be returned. So what we basically did so far was we brought an inference from the Mishnah. It never said it explicitly in the Mishnah, but it was an inference from the Mishnah that seemed to imply if the get is found and the husband says, give it to my wife, you can give it. How so? Aren't we worried about maybe it's someone else's get? And the answer is, right, it depends on the scenario. You need to be worried it's someone else's get, you need caravans going, and you need there to be known that there's two people by that name in the city. Now we're going to have a very parallel sugya, but with a few minor differences. And then later we're going to highlight the differences. Rabbi Zeira Rami Matnitin Abraita. Rabbi Zeira brought a question on that Mishnah from Gittin, from a Tosefta, not from the inference in our Mishnah, but the exact same contradiction, and we'll get to perhaps the exact same answer, or at least partial same answer. Homishani. And then he resolved it. So let's see what it is. Tanan. So again, we're going to quote the Mishnah. Hamevi get ba'avani menu. Mitzol alter kasher imlav pasul. So again, you bring a get, you lose the get. If you find it immediately, you can give it. If you don't find it immediately, you have to worry it's someone else's. You can't give the get. Urimini, and that contradicts the Tosefta. The Tosefta says, Matzah get isha bashuk. If you find a get of a woman in a shuk, sounds like our Mishnah. But here, instead of inferring it from the Mishnah, it says it explicitly in the Mishnah, in the Tosefta. Bizman shabal modeh yachzir laisha. If the husband admits that it was his get, and he gave it to the woman, you can give it back to the woman. No problem. And then there's another line, which isn't so relevant for our contradiction. That's already our contradiction. But ein habal modeh, if the husband doesn't admit it, lo yachzir lo lezeh v'lo lezeh. He doesn't get it, she doesn't get it. Now, she doesn't get it because we don't know if he gave the get. And if he didn't give the get, then she can claim I'm not married and go marry someone, and that is very serious. He can't get the get because why? This goes back to what we saw earlier in the daf. If he takes the get, he could claim, why do I have the get? It's proof I paid the ketuba money. Otherwise, why would she have given me the get? So then he'll get away without paying the ketuba, and maybe he did already pay, but we don't know. Like, we can't just give it to him and say, here, you keep the get. So nobody can get it. But anyway, the key line was, Katani miyad, it said in the first line, Bizman shabal modeh yachzir leisha. Afilu lizman meruba. It didn't say only if you find it immediately, it sounds like, right? This is, we found a get. We don't even know when he gave the get originally, and we give it back. And that contradicts the Mishnah in Gittin. Umeshane, and like Raba, he said, Kam bizmakom shashayirot metzuyot. The Mishnah in Gittin was a place where there's common caravans to be going back and forth, and that's where we're worried it came from someone else. Kam bimkom she'ena shayirot metzuyot. And the Tosefta is talking about what there aren't. So the same way of resolving the contradiction. However, if you remember, then the Gemara after quoted Rabbi, it said, well, if we don't say the following, though, that he also required a second criteria, then Rabbi would contradict himself. Now, Rabbi Zeira didn't mention the second thing about this. You have to have it also, in order to be worried about this, that there were two Yosef and Shimon's in the city. So, Ikadamre, some people say, if you're only not going to give it back also if you know there's two Yosef and Shimon's, just like Raba said. And and some people say, he says, even if there aren't two Yosef and Shimon's, and he disagrees with Raba. He thinks only the Shayarot is enough. As long as you have caravans, we're already worried. You don't have to know that there's two people by the same name in your city. So now we're going to go back to, why did Raba bring it from an inference from our Mishnah, the contradiction, and Rabbi Zeira brought it from the Tosefta? It's really the same contradiction. So Bishlama Raba lo amar Rabbi Zeira. We understand why Raba didn't use Rabbi Zeira's contradiction, because matnitin alim alei lakshuye. A Mishnah is always stronger than a Tosefta, because the Mishnah ended up in the book, right? Tosefta ended up in a different book called the Tosefta, which was much less learned and didn't have the same status of prominence that the Mishnah did. So if you can bring a contradiction from a Mishnah, it's much stronger. Ela Rabbi Zeira, my time alone, Raba. So why didn't Rabbi Zeira then bring the contradiction from the Mishnah? And Amar L'cha, he could say, Mi katane ha'amar tnuno tnim afilu lizman meruba. It never said in the Mishnah explicitly that we give it back. It only said in the Tosefta explicitly. We inferred it from the Mishnah. But perhaps, Dilma, you could say, ha'amar tnuno tnim ulalam kedekayim al alter. Maybe the inference in our Mishnah would be, well, if the husband says it's okay, you could give it to her as long as it was right away. It was lost and immediately found. And then it wouldn't go against the Braita at all. So since in the Tosefta, they wouldn't go against the Mishnah and Gittin at all. Since in the Tosefta it was explicit, that's a better, stronger contradiction. Now we're going to say, Lemanda Amar le Rabbi Zeira v'kom shashayro mitzuyot v'af agav shaloch zekushne Yosef and Shimon upligi de Raba. If you say that Rabbi Zeira, in order to say you cannot use the get and give it back to her, is only all you need is one criteria, shayarot. Well, what does he disagree with Raba about, who says you need the two criteria in order to make the get no good? So, what's the root of their machloket? Raba saval de katane koma sebetin hareze yachzil. When it said any document that was ratified by the court, you can give back. De ishtakach bebetin askina. It means that was found in the court. Meaning, what's found in the court? Ubeitin kimkom shashayot mitzuyot. Now, it says, if it's in a court, you find it, you can give it back. Or, right, that's what they assume. It was at least found near the court, even though it doesn't say that, okay? It said anything that was ratified by the court, but we assume it was found near the court, and the court is a public place. So how can we give it back? It must be, it must be, you only, right, it said that in the Mishnah, you can give it back. So it means, when can you give it back? When you don't know that there's two Yosef and Shimon's in the city. And then that means that you need both criteria. And that's why you can have a case where it was found in the court where there are shayarot. It's common that people go by there, but because you don't know if Shnei Yosef and Shimon, you can actually give it back. And Rabbi Zeira amar l'chamikatani kol ma'aseh beitin shenimtzeu bebeitin. It says anything ratified by the court. It didn't say it was found near the court. We mean you find something in a random spot where there aren't shayarot, and that's the issue, right? Kol ma'aseh beitin yachzir katani l'olam de'eshkach habarad. No, it must be it was found outside in a place where there aren't shayarot, and then that's why you can give it back, because that's the only criteria. So they disagree about what that case in this upcoming Mishnah is referring to. Now we're going to end with Rabbi Zeira brought this contradiction between the Tosefta, which says very clearly we give it back to her, and the Mishnah, which says we don't give it back, not to her, not to him, right? So according to this, right, and only, right, sorry, the Matzah, right, if time passed, we don't give it back. So Rabbi Zeira resolved the contradiction by saying Shayarot Metzia and Shayarot Metzia, and that resolved the contradiction. But Rabbi Yirmia and Rabbi Ashi are each going to give different resolutions to the contradiction. Rabbi Yirmia Amar Kigon deka'amre edim me'olam lo chatamnu ela al get echad shel Yosef ben Shimon. When the Tosefta says you can return it, right? The Tosefta said very clearly. Matzah get isha bashuk bizman shabal modeh yachzir laisha. The husband admits you give it back to women. We're not worried it's someone else's. Why are we not worried? So he says, Rabbi Yirmiyah, the case must be that witnesses also said, oh, we're the witnesses who signed on the get, and we only signed on the get for this guy. We didn't sign on another get with the same Yosef, with another guy, Yosef and Shimon and Miriam bat Rachel. So they say, okay, what if there were witnesses? I don't need a Tosefta to tell me it's okay to return it. Witnesses testified that they signed on this document. So no, they say, this is kind of, again, this is how far you take this concern. You might have thought, you might have thought, maybe there's two Yosef and Shimon who are married to Miriam bat Rachel, who had two witnesses, David ben Moshe and blah, 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 the exact same witnesses, and that this guy these two witnesses who come forward and say this was us, and we definitely signed for this guy. Maybe the witnesses signed were two other guys with the exact same names. So comes the stuff to, Adkan, right? That's too much. We don't worry about that. Rav Ashi gives a different reason, which is going to be all connected to things we're going to see in the second chapter. Rav Ashi amar kigon deka'amar nekev yesh bo b'tzad ploni. We give it back when the husband gives us siman. He tells us, I know that this get is mine and he doesn't see the get, right? He says, I know the get is mine because my get had a hole right next to the letter Aleph on line 2, okay, for example. And then Gemara points out, dafka b'tzado ploni, afal nekev ba'amalo. If he says there was a hole in the document, that doesn't help because lots of documents have holes in them. He has to identify where the hole is, and then we can assume it really is his get. Okay, so these are two other resolutions to this contradiction. So what we basically did from this part of the sugya on from the Mishnah is we brought the same contradiction either from an inference from the Mishnah or from the Tosefta, which basically seems to imply we do give it back and we're not worried it's someone else's, whereas the Mishnah and Gittin seem to say we have to worry it's someone else's. As soon as like a few minutes passes, maybe someone else's get got washed up on the shore, got moved up, right? We don't know. And then the question is how to resolve it. We have Rabbi and Rabbi Zeira who resolve these contradictions either in exactly identically similar ways or partially similar ways by talking about Shayarot Metzia and Shayarot Metzia, and perhaps also both, or maybe only one of them saying, and Huchzaku Shnei Yosef and Shimon. And in those cases, you have to be concerned. Otherwise, you don't have to be concerned that someone else's get. And then we have Rabbi Yirmia and Rabbi Ashi, who each gave different other resolutions to the contradiction between the Tosefta and the Mishnah, which also, by the way, could resolve the contradiction between the inference and our Mishnah as well. And with that, we finish for today. We will pick up with this in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everybody a Shavua Tov and a good day. B'sorot Tovot.